Hello there, my name is Phil Williams and I would like to welcome you to Audio Angling, the podcast site of fishingfilmsandfacts.co.uk. The appearance of barbel in Lancashire's River Ribble is a fairly recent phenomenon, certainly within my angling lifetime. Populations indigenous to the UK are more typically found in rivers draining the east and southeastern parts of England. This results from rivers like the Thames and the Trent having been connected to mainland Europe as tributaries of the River Rhine, prior to ice melt raising sea levels leading to the isolation of Britain as an island group several thousand years ago. Elsewhere, barbel were almost certainly introduced. In the River Severn, for example, the Angling Times put them there back in the 1950s, a part of what they termed as Operation Barbel, which links us very nicely into this particular debate regarding the River Ribble, as it was fish from the Severn that were responsible for seeding the Lancashire population. As a one-time coarse fish farmer for the Environment Agency, I know only too well the difficulties in transporting fish around the country, even in small numbers and without trying to conceal them. So I can only imagine that when the River Ribble was secretly seeded with barbel, it would have been done in dribs and drabs with a few fish here and there by anglers over quite an extensive period throughout the 1960s and 70s. There is unfortunately no direct evidence of that. But we do know that anglers were responsible, because in 1974 or thereabouts, North West Water Authority fishery bailiffs caught some dropping barbel into the Ribble from the M6 bridge, for which they were ultimately prosecuted. As I understand things, there was no actual law forbidding the movement of fish between waters at that time. That came into being with the NRA during the late 1980s, so the basis for this prosecution is a little unclear. Even so, speaking on behalf of North West Water Authority, the barbel was described by their barrister as a vile and useless coarse fish. In light of where we are today, I wonder if the powers that be would still say that now. The Ribble, as we shall see, has, or leastways had, the capability of producing some of the biggest barbel in the country, but only along quite a short section running east from Preston to maybe the Calder or Hodder Foot, with the tidal stretch at Preston producing most of the biggest fish. To find out why, and everything else there is to know about barbel in the Ribble, except of course for specific hotspots, I'm joined here by coarse specimen hunter Mike Winrow. Now you obviously fish for and have caught a lot of very good barbel from the River Ribble, but in many ways Lancashire Barbel, which have been on the river's agenda for around 30 years now, are an even more recent item on your agenda, despite your Lancastrian roots.
Well, I was born in Preston in 1961, but funnily enough I actually first came across barbel in the Ribble sort of in the early 1980s. Like in those days, we used to sort of catch the bus uptown to sort of fish at London Road at Shaw's Arms. And in the early years, probably late 70s, no sign of barbel in them days. But funnily enough, it wasn't very long before you started hearing about them. And we certainly had a friend that used to fish up there quite a lot. And around about 1980, he started catching like little ones, maybe about 3 or 4 ounces. And then it wasn't very long after that I then went to university, and while I was there I remember my friend sort of writing to me, and he'd had a couple of £4 barbel at Elston, and like funnily enough it's still a really good peg by the way, which kind of tells you something I suppose. But somehow by then barbel were in the river and they were kind of there in a position to be able to sort of like grow on, I guess. After that, though, I sort of then moved away to Sheffield in 1983 and then I ended up down in London, just north of London, sort of in Hertfordshire in 1987. So we never really got to grips with barbel in those days, plus my mates started getting married and having children and things like that. And then also the Ribble started to go in decline in the 80s as the cormorants started getting to work on the silverfish or whatever. So really you were kind of watching it from a distance. But all the time you were learning about barbel fishing or whatever, because obviously I'd never done any. But I was fishing the River Lee and a famous stretch called Fisher's Green, which even these days in the news, like I know somebody that's had a £9 4-ounce chub out of it, for example, like 1 ounce under the record. The guy actually also holds a perch record, by the way, as well. He won the Dredden Specimen Cup that year, believe it or not. But yes, I learned more about fishing with the barbel firstly on hemp, and then in latter years started fishing what they call the time bomb method, which I'll probably explain later on, and that's like fishing with pellets and paste and so on. That was on the trend. So finally, sort of was in a position to fish the river a lot more. Sort of like 2005, I was lucky enough to stop work, and I was able to come back a lot more, because up to then I used to just come back at Christmas and the New Year when conditions would be cold and horrible, or the river would be well up, and in those days I didn't realise that's the time to go fishing for them. We were so used to chub fishing when coloured water was the kiss of death, and you were then fishing for days or whatever. So yeah, I'd sort of got a better method, and it was just a case of getting a start. And well, as I say, once you started fishing for them and you really worked hard at it, it was, well, some of the catch, frankly, amazing, really. And as I say, it just built from there. And finally I moved back to Lancashire like 3 years ago, and yet again, blimey. So yes, it's been a bit of a long tale, and you've sort of watched it from afar and all the rest of it. But say, once you've finally got to grips with it, it's been amazing what you've been able to catch.
So we know that the barbel is an introduced species to the Ribble, and that like all newcomers, it would have had to find its particular niche by fitting with both the terrain and the river's other inhabitants. How then did the barbel and the indigenous species adapt and find living together?
Well, I think the key to it, a lot of it, is probably what happens with the cormorants, because I know when we went down to the Ribble in the late 70s, early 80s, down at Shaw's Arms, it was absolutely loaded with silverfish. But then the cormorants moved inland, and, it's a different sort of subject at all, but I guess it's probably down to the common fisheries policy and all the rest of it. But by about the end of the 80s, they'd essentially cleaned the river out of the dace, the roach, which were probably struggling anyway, actually, thinking back about it, because if you looked at a river like the Trent, back in the 50s and 60s, it was a famous roach river, but as soon as industry started cleaning up, you started getting the dace and the chub came back. Then latterly, you then got the barbel, if you see what I mean. So roach must be more pollution tolerant. So when we first fished it, we caught roach, but they tended to be, we got one or two absolute beauties just under £2, but we never catch any smaller ones, so they were probably on decline anyway. Then you got the cormorants, and they'd also clean out the smaller chub as well. You ended with a situation that probably by the late 80s, and my mates had just stopped fishing because we didn't really know what to do about the barbel, and I used to keep nagging them, come on, there's barbel in the river and all the rest of it. But yeah, you had a river that probably almost a virgin river where whatever chub survived grew really big. Like I've got a friend who's the friends that have just started fishing again, and they were gobsmacked to the size of the chub you were getting. Like 5-pounders were common, and other people caught 6-pounders. I remember one of them had 2 6-pounders in a day, and there was even the odd person even mentioned 7-pounders, but I'm not that sure about that. But you also had a virgin river for the barbel, and they would have had an ecological niche to exploit. Like there's a very useful comparison probably with the Severn, where they were introduced, got a population explosion, say a bit like Zander in the Fens as well, really. And by the 70s, people were getting great big catches in matches, but ultimately the Severn produced a British record barbel in the late 90s before finally its kind of numbers seemed to stabilise, though actually it sounds now numbers are starting to drop again, so you've got a very much a yo-yo effect. But yeah, you had, as I say, a virgin river for the chub to grow very big in, but in smaller numbers, and a river for the barbel to increase in numbers, but because they're such a peggy fish, it wasn't as obvious that the numbers were there. So I suppose that's what's happened. The other thing I've noticed is the decline in the eels. We used to get loads of bootlace eels when we first started. When I started fishing the river again seriously, £1.50, £2 eels or whatever. So they would have mopped up fry and small fish as well, like the eggs and so on. But eels have been struggling, really. But yet again, that probably gave them a start as well.
What's the river like in terms of geography along the main barbel holding stretch?
It's a very rocky river. That's the one thing, as I say. As you go up the river, you find it's more and more rocky. You get quite long areas of shallows, and then you'll get pools in between the shallows where it just widens out and slows down or whatever. And I think, as we'll find, in the summer you need to be fishing like in the rapids areas where there's more flow, where there's gullies and channels. In the winter, the fish have been washed out of the rapids, you need to be fishing the wider open bits. And then there's also flood pegs as well, which are sort of a different sort of breed entirely. But you can kind of see the gradual, as it goes further up towards Ribchester and beyond, you can kind of see it rockier, but it's obviously the Barbel are okay with that. Now, how much further they go, I don't know. Once you get past Ribchester, it's basically game fishing all the way. So who's to say? There's obviously quite a lot more river, and I even once came across somebody, there was a plan to put a barrage across the Ribble, and they said the Ribble was a unique river in that it was the only river in the country which was essentially two rivers in one. And then what they meant by that was it started high up in the moors, and then it became a lowland river for a few miles round about Long Preston before starting all over again, if you see what I mean. So if Barbel did manage to get up there, who's to say? But at the end of the day, it's all game fishing up there.
So have the chub had to adapt to accommodate the Barbel, or has it been the other way around?
I think they've just had to find a balance naturally, if you see what I mean. It'll be interesting to see what happens in numbers going forward. I find myself that you catch chub of all sizes. If you're fishing the slightly pacier, faster water, you will catch plenty of small chub. Yet again, it's interesting what happened on the Severn, because people used to say, oh, where have all the chub gone? But then they've sort of come back as the river's found a balance, and I suspect we'll get a similar sort of thing on the Ribble. It's also interesting as well, is that said all the roach and days cleaned out by the cormorants. Well, the last few years I've really not seen many cormorants, and now down in the tidal at Preston, they are getting huge bags, £50 bags of roach and dace at places like Church Deeps, and I would assume all the other old haunts that people used to fish in the 70s and 80s. So from being a river that was big chub and increasing Barbel numbers probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, suddenly you're getting a much more balanced river.
Is this then the kind of rebalancing act that all rivers must go through when something else different comes along?
I think it's just down to breeding years and things like that, really. Like, yet again, the explosion of when they put zander into the fens, okay, that's a predator, but seemed to be a population explosion, but you don't hear anything about it now. And okay, like, zander have been introduced into things like the canal network, and people are going on about that, but actually you don't hear people complaining. Like, I think what happened in the fens is it probably coincided with a natural, well, probably not a natural down cycle of the bream. My personal opinion would be that agricultural chemicals probably affected it, and the zander were just introduced at the wrong time, but they've probably not been breeding. And I do think that with some fish, it can be surprising how rare they have a successful breeding year. Like, I've done a lot of tench fishing, and the thing about tench is they lay hundreds of thousands of eggs every year, and they live a long time, and yet when you think about it, in their lifetime, all they have to do is produce one male fish and one female fish to propagate the species, really. So they've laid millions of eggs, so it's mind-blowing. And we'll probably come to this, but actually looking at the river going forward, I have to say I'm not catching that many small barbel, whereas when I first fished it, I remember one day when I had 17 barbel, but I had 7 adults and I had 10 baby ones mixed in them. But now I'm only catching the odd pound or 2 pound, whereas in those days I was catching lots of them. So I think what happens when they breed is a lot of the fry and a lot of the eggs get mopped up. And of course the floods of this year, and we've had 1 or 2 old style winters this last 3 or 4 years, they'll be having their effect as well.
In terms of the barbel being free to spread upstream should they want to, are there any physical barriers that might prevent this?
I don't know that. There is one weir at the top end of Samlesbury, but obviously, as I say, my mate caught a barbel in 1982, the 2 barbel then, so that didn't stop them for very long. And when you see the river in flood, like it can flood 15 or 16 foot up, there's nothing to stop them. Whether there's anything bigger further up river, but as I say, it is game fishing up there anyway. I think by now they've had plenty of time to get where they're going to get to. As I say, I think the balance has already got to the point where the river from a barbel fishing numbers has probably peaked, and it'll just settle down to stability from now on.
So we have quite a well-defined stretch of the river hosting most of the barbel, but within that there will also be preferred local holding areas which themselves will change according to conditions. What then should you be looking for in terms of a good holding area, and how might conditions change that?
Well, I will always split it down into 3 distinct categories. I look at it in terms of summer pegs, which to me are slightly faster water, pacey but not really fast. You're really looking for like smooth water. Plus obviously in the summer the water levels might be very low and you need to fish where the water flow concentrates. So typically that will be rapids, just above rapids, just below, maybe even in them if you can find a bit of smooth water. Also, because the river is very rocky, you may find that there's gullies in the bedrock, or there's channels where basically all the flow is just on one side of the river and it's relatively narrow, maybe 15 yards wide or something like that. So they're the sort of places to go for in the summer. But obviously in the winter there's more flow and they'll have been washed out of a lot of things. Like the channels, there'll be still fish there, but the rapids, no. Like the other thing to say in the summer as well is you get a tinge of colour in the river as well due to algae or whatever, and it's quite notable that from about September onwards, as the colour starts to drop out of the river, you find slowly but surely the summer pegs stop fishing, and by about the end of October, they're not in the summer pegs. If you're catching barbel in a peg in November, you can guarantee that you will still be catching it throughout the winter, but you don't get that many spots like that, if you see what I mean. So yeah, for in the summer you're looking for pacier, smooth water, what I would call stick flow pace. In the winter, the fish will have dropped down into the wider open pools. Like you still need a touch of pace, waggler pace or something like that, so slightly slower than a stick flow pace. But you don't really want still water unless there's, the only exception I've come across is if it's very rocky under the water, because what seems to happen where you get rocks is you'll actually get, there's a lot of sandstone bedrock in the Ribble, and you'll get sand gathering behind these things. If you go out for a wade, you'll find the bedrock's completely eroded in all sorts of peculiar shapes, and you can just imagine the barbel in the summer rooting around in the sand and all that sort of thing. So they're the sort of pegs you'd fish in the winter, apart from if there's a bit of water on in the summer. The fish won't be in the rapids, they'll just drop down into the slightly steadier water, which is where you would tend to fish in the winter months. And then the other pegs to look for is where to fish for when it's in flood. And I'd define flood at certainly 4 or 5 foot up, and a lot of stretches, if they're a quicker stretch, even 3 foot. What you're looking for there is somewhere it's really still on the inside when it's right down, and you really want the flow to be right on the far side, and as the river rises the fish will move across the river. If the flow was in the middle of the river, then they might split in 2 directions, but if you know somewhere which is really still when it's down and the flow's on the far side, and they'll come across the river, and then you've just kind of got to search them out on that little bit. So they're the sort of pegs. The other thing I would say about floodwater fishing, while I remember, is they won't be right under your feet. You will get chub right under your feet, but you don't tend to catch them in coloured water, but once in a while you do. Barbel aren't like chub, and they're looking to feed in coloured water. Like warm coloured water, yes, you should be running down the bank, basically. So remember that, and I tend to fish at the distance I can hold with a 3 or 4 ounce feeder, because I'm a feeder fisherman. So you'll probably find, unless it's really high, you can hold out at 15 yards or something like that. But yeah, don't drop it right in the side. Don't think they're hiding out of the way. They're searching for food. And to be honest, if it's in flood, they can cope with anything. It's really up to you how brave you are. I've caught barbel at 10 foot up, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But at 6 or 7 foot up, you're not so bad. As I said, the only thing to then watch out for is if it was in the summer and the river's weedy, it's just a nightmare. You won't be able to hold. And similarly, November, December time, when you get lots of leaves coming down, I suppose if you knew somewhere where they were right under your feet, you might be able to float fish, potentially. But yeah, that prevents you doing that.
How does the Ribble balance in 2013 compare to other mixed fisheries around the country?
I've never fished the Yorkshire rivers. That would be the one that would be easiest to compare with, because they're kind of like spate rivers, like because the Ribble flies up and down just like that. If you're probably comparing it with other rivers, I think you've got to look at big rivers like the Severn and the Trent, and in more recent years the Wye. They're the ones that most you will be comparing with. I suppose it's down to the individual river. Like the nature of the Ribble is that essentially it's, once you get past the tidal, it's chub and barbel. In the tidal it's different because there's carp in there and there's bream, and There's perch and, well, you see people piking in the Ribble these days, which I never saw when I was younger as well. Plus you got the roach and the dace, so you will get the roach and dace further upriver, and you look on various internet forums, and if anybody trots up there, if they have a day trotting, they do okay, like 10, 15, 20 pound bags, they have good days, so they are there. But the way I fish, which I'm afraid is the standard 2 rods in the air these sort of days, feed a fish or whatever and all the rest of it, I'm not going to catch them sort of species or anything like that. Just chub and barbel. But I say I fished it on the Trent, and it was kind of interesting fishing the Trent. Your chub were your bread and butter fish. They kind of got everywhere. And then you either got carp and bream pegs or you got barbel pegs. And then on all of them you'd catch chub or whatever. As regards smaller rivers down south, well, those rivers in general are struggling, really, because they've suffered with abstraction, like taking water out of them, and fish just aren't breeding properly. Like I fished on the Lee, and all the time that I was there was never a successful breeding year. The fish got bigger and bigger. Like one of the first ones I caught down there was about 5 3/4 pound. By the time I'd finished, I'd had one over 14 pound. But it took about 10 years before I caught a double figure one out. They just got bigger and bigger and fewer. And as I say, I've fished this stretch of the Lee which produces 8 and even 9 pound chub. But it is rock hard fishing. You got big name anglers, and I remember Martin Bowler once fished it, and he said 3 days he got a 12 pound barbel. After it, he says, thank God for that. That's the hardest river I've ever fished in my life. So the southern rivers, you can get a false impression they are not healthy. But as I said, I think the Ribble looks quite a healthy river, as what I can tell. I don't think pollution is a big problem. You occasionally hear about things from the colder, but I'm not totally convinced. You may get something once in a while, thins fish out locally, but I don't know. I think it may be just a convenient thing to blame, really.
I suppose that when the barbel first went in, there would initially have been something of a population explosion as the smaller fish laid claim to territory. But how long did it take for the better fish to put in ashore?
Well, it's difficult to remember because obviously I was watching from afar, and I know my mate had a couple of 4-pounders back in about 1982, 1983. I would have thought it would be the late 80s, maybe the early 90s. It's kind of interesting because I used to fish the Lee, and until very, very recently, the river records went up in parallel. It was kind of almost uncanny how they were just like ounces apart or whatever. And I know somebody's had a bigger one now out of the Lee, but it ended up at one point that the river record out of the Ribble was £15.14 and out of the Lee it was £15.15 or something like that. It was uncanny. So I think that's when it probably produced the first doubles, but I would guess the explosion in doubles probably occurred when those 3 to 4 ounce fish that were being caught around about 1980-ish, by the time they'd grown to maturity. And they are a long-lived fish. I know some people think they only live 15, 16 years, but from what I've read and certainly experience of the Lee and just watching the fish get bigger and bigger until finally they started succumbing to old age, I would say about 30 years is the sort of a lifespan, even in a proper river like the Ribble. So yeah, the first doubles probably late 80s, early 90s, but I think in terms of numbers of them, my best guess would probably be more like late 90s, I would have said.
The current river record, caught by John Monaghan at £15.14 ounces, was taken 4 years ago. Would it be fair then to say that the upward progression has now peaked, or might it still go even bigger yet?
Well, I could be proven wrong within the next year or two, but my gut feeling is I think the explosion of the very biggest fish that had a virgin river to go at, I suspect that growth might have finished by now. It's been very noticeable this last 2 or 3 years that the number of doubles that people caught has dropped dramatically. You're not really getting people reporting stuff in the angling press. At one stage it was almost a weekly occurrence, and it's not happening now. And as I said, those fish had a virgin river to exploit, and when you compare it like a river like the Lee, which has produced giant chub, and this was a fairly short length, like probably a couple of miles, heavily fished by some of the best anglers in the country, piling the bait in, and yet the river records were virtually identical, and it's much warmer in the south as well. I can tell you, having moved back up again. So I think that's probably the limit. And then another useful comparison is the Yorkshire rivers. If you look at the records there, it's surprising how small some of them are. Like I was looking last night, and there's a couple of, like the River Ewer, for example. The Barbel record there is only £11 something. Another one's like £12, £13, £14. In fact, the only one where the river record was £15 plus was with the River Wharfe. And a lot of those rivers, well, like the River Don that goes through Sheffield, their rivers have cleaned up as well. They're the same sort of where they've had a fresh start. But yeah, once you get past about the Trent, sort of £15 for a river record's about as far as you're going to get. So I think it'll probably stabilise. Like it's been interesting. People are starting to catch more doubles. As I said, there was this drop-off. Plus, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is around about 2008, it looks as if something did happen. There must have been something maybe deoxygenated the river, because I remember I've talked to both the Environment Agency bailiff that bailiffs it and salmon anglers, and they've seen numbers of dead barbel in the side, and okay, EA bailiff thought it was down to people mishandling fish and all the rest of it, but I suspect there was something that had deoxygenated it, and since at that point the catches of the barbel drop. And I've talked to other anglers, and the general agreement is you're catching about 60% of what you were before then, but then things have stabilised, albeit that this last year has been a bit of a struggle, but certainly the last couple of years before that were terrific conditions, like lovely showery weather that keeps topping the river with a bit of flow and a bit of colour. That's what you want, and certainly in the summer anyway, from a barbel fishing perspective.
Do we necessarily always hear about specimen barbel catches though? Because some of the better fish are taken accidentally on worm by salmon anglers, who generally are not interested in the species.
It's possible. I've once seen a salmon angler get it. He actually got a salmon as well that day, and he got a £12 barbel. But I think the way that people fish, they will catch. It was very noticeable that I think there's something in the north that there's not as many specimen anglers anyway, because it's not that sort of part of the country or whatever. Like down south, you were almost forced to become a specimen angler. If you wanted to catch fish, you had to, it was, there was a huge difference between sort of like up here in the north, there'd be lots of fish, but smaller. Down south, bigger, but not very many. I remember once taking a friend on this gravel pit where I'd caught a £7 tench. We blanked. He couldn't believe it. A blanking in July. Anglers, they're a bit more laid back in here as well about reporting their fish. Like obviously some people do report, but when I first started fishing the river again, the number of people you talk to were talking about £13 or £14 barbel. And as I say, one or two of the tales I told, like there was one chap told me about one fish he'd had that had like just basically ran up river for 100 yards or whatever, and it was like, he hadn't got any scales, and he put it back, and he said, I'd love to know how big it was. And I'd have been moving heaven and earth to find out how big it was, if you see what I mean. So people were much more laid back. But yeah, you talk to people, and yeah, they certainly catch them. It's not like, the salmon anglers have some sort of advantage or anything like that. I suppose the only thing is they fish places where coarse anglers don't, generally speaking. And this is one of my things, is get out there and try all these little spots. It's a big wide river, and if you see anywhere where there's a little bit of a run, a bit of smooth water, give it a go, because you'll catch very quickly. I remember once talking to a chap by some rapids and pointing a run on the far side, saying that'd always be worth half an hour of your time, and tried it about a couple of months later and weighed it out, and it didn't look very promising at all. There was lots of fairly large pebbles and rocks about the place, and anyway, I got 15 in 2 hours. They would just concentrate on that one particular peg. So, yeah, where the salmon anglers fish, do not ignore them. That's what I would say.
Whatever the reason, both the growth and the numerical explosion now seem to have found a balance, which is roughly what?
Well, going off my records, and as I say, you've got to look at the way I fish, which is basically 2 rods up in the air on the feeder with pellets and paste and all the rest of it. Over the course of a season, I tend to catch 2 barbel to every chub, but I do obviously have the days where I do have a really good barbel day, and especially in the summer you won't catch great numbers of chub. You might catch sort of 5, 6 on a good day, something like that. If you want to catch chub more, you need to sort of wait till the winter when they've concentrated more, and you can sort of rove around with liquidized bread, like half an hour a peg, and fish bread and so on and so forth. As regards catches, well, even these days, despite the decline from 2008 onwards, if you find the pegs where they really concentrate on in summer, you can get great big catches. Like my best in the day is 44, and I think I had about 4 chub that day. And I've also had other catches where I've had 3 or 4 more, where I've had 30 or more, and a few 20s, and it's not the same peg, but there's just 1 or 2 very special pegs out there. But from what I've seen, there's quite a lot of pegs where you've got a chance of catching 6 or 7. What I've found is, on these stretches, at any one moment in time, there's probably only 2 or maybe 3 good barbel pegs, and we're talking like mile and a half of river or something like that. They do move around according to the conditions and height, and it's just a case of getting to know it. But what I have found is that if you're on the fish and it's good conditions, you will catch very quickly. Like even in the winter, if you put a bait on the nose, you can catch first or second cast. So what you can do is kind of exploit that by trying other spots. If you're not catching in the summer, I'd probably give a peg about an hour and a half. In the winter, it's a lot harder to judge because the water conditions are colder and you're fishing more open pegs and you've got to give them a chance. But in the summer, you can rove along, sort of semi-rove it, and if you're on fish, you will catch quickly, and that way you sort of build up your knowledge of your stretch very quickly.
To know if your reading of the swim is correct, and whether or not staying put or moving on is justified, you have to be confident in your own ability to catch fish. Otherwise, it could all turn out to be wasted effort. So can we now start looking at getting the best out of a likely looking swim for both the barbel and the chub?
If you're on a good barbel peg, you will catch quickly. As I say, you can even catch first or second cast, and in the summer, I will give it maybe an hour and a half in a peg. What I've tended to find is that even in good conditions, they won't really move very far. Like if you're more than 10 yards downstream of them, you would never even know they're there. They're not like chub, they don't sort of move around. They will move a bit from further down, but even then you can find bits where, you've caught fish on a peg, and then you just move down the bank 15, 20 yards and start fishing, and you start catching all over again. So they find spots that they really want to be. I actually remember this about thinking about the shallow water. I once caught a barbel in some rapids, and this was in the summer, and I said, just a tinge of colour or whatever. And I put it back, and it promptly swam 2 or 3 yards upriver, and it stuck its head behind a rock. So it was in about a foot and a half of water top whack. And it just stayed there. Then 5 minutes later, I caught another barbel, played it out, and that fish was still there. It was as happy as Larry in about a foot and a half of water. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend fishing in that sort of depth, if you see what I mean, but it kind of showed that you need to be kind of like bang on them, if you see what I mean. So when it comes to roving, you've kind of got to be impatient, but take your time as well, if you see what I mean. You'll kind of get a sixth sense. Of some pegs you'll kind of know within half an hour that there's nothing there. Whereas others you've got to give them about an hour and a half. But if it did take an hour and a half and suddenly you started catching one after another, next time start off 15 yards further downriver. Or if you're caught on your upstream rod and not your downstream, next time move up a bit. Now it is obviously hard in the winter. You need to give it 2 or 3 hours. And the other thing as well is barbel are very temperature dependent. I measure the water temperature, and sort of once it gets into the winter, my rule of thumb is like if the water's like 45 degrees, which is about 7 degrees C and above, then you barbel fish. But if it's 40 or less, just go chub fishing. You might catch a bob, but have a nice day's chub fishing or something like that, and then it's just in between. But in the summer months, which I would define up to about the end of September, well, anything goes basically. Fish on your feeder with pellets, and I take about 8 to 10 pints of pellets for a day. Can get through that amount. Though, funnily enough, if you have a really good day, you'll end up fishing one rod and you'll not use as much. But as things drop off into the winter, you start cutting back on the bait. Or actually, what I do, I just use fish meal ground bait in the feeder rather than pellets. So you've got the smell to attract them or whatever. I use this so-called time bomb approach, which there was once a Matt Hayes programme on Fishing the Severn. They were travelling from Ireland across to East Anglia or whatever. He fished on the Severn at Hampton Load, and, well, basically, there was somebody fishing below them, but the method was so good it pulled up the fish from below. So that told you what, it was quite good, but I'd already come across a method earlier anyway. But yeah, that to me is the key. You've got to kind of locate where they are for like the conditions. So you've got summer pegs, winter pegs, and flood pegs. And then obviously like the one thing you've got to watch for is the height, because if there's a bit of water on, you will find the fish will drop more towards the slower winter pegs. Like the flood pegs are a breed unto themselves in some ways. But yeah, do that, locate the fish, then you fish with a good method. Feeder and pellets take some beating. In more marginal conditions, you might want to start using hemp in the feeder, which is a classic thing that nobody ever uses these days. At one point, you used to see the bank embedded with hemp, but not these days. And yeah, hemp and castor or hemp and maggot or something. Then finally, if you're not catching, just move. But I think it's one of them things is, when you've done it and you've realised how quickly you can catch, you'll then realise, well, why not just try it in a different peg? And as I say, it's such a big, wide river, and it's such a long river as well, that there are lots of potential spots, albeit that they certainly don't all have fish. Like, I think I'm successful about 1 in 3 or something like that. You can get some pegs, they look absolutely perfect, and you try it, and all you might catch is a chub or something like that or whatever. But they're the 3 things. Just locate the fish a good method, and if you're not catching, move, and be confident in your ability. And yeah, they will come quickly.
Before we split the talk along species-specific lines, can you compare and contrast ribble, chub and barbel tactics as a general concept?
Well, to be honest, you tend to find they're fairly mixed up together from what I've seen. Chub will get about the place a bit more, so you will find them in slightly faster water, but you'll tend to catch a smaller chub, or if there are any baby barbel about, that's where you would tend to catch them. You also tend to find chub in slower water, especially in the winter as well. They're a lazier fish than barbel is the best way to do it. Like, for example, when the river's been in flood and it's starting to drop, the barbel are the first ones to move back out into the river. The chub will tend to stay down the side more. And as I say, the classic for chub fishing is what they call the crease, where you just fish on the edge of a flow. That's where to fish for the chub. The barbel, you should really be in the flow, if you see what I mean. There are exceptions, but it seems to be where there's just something under the water that they really like. But generally speaking, they're mixed up. The only difference is in the winter time, when the temperature is just too cold for barbel and you go chub fishing. And while I say my favourite method is to rove around with liquid ice, but yet again it's an instant sort of fishing thing. If you've fished a peg for 20 minutes, half an hour, if you've not caught, move on. And as soon as you start getting taps and knocks and things, yet again it's time to move. Though I have a little twist in that I carry steak with me, like bloody casserole steak, like you only need 2 or 3 ounces a day. Put that on and you'll normally nick out an extra bite or a fish or 2 or something like that. But before you know it, it's time to move on. But generally speaking, the chub are more all over the river in the summer. You'll sometimes see a fish right on the far side topping must be about a foot of water. What on earth is it doing there? You know, so they get about the place. But generally speaking, they are in the same one. Like, chub can be a bit wary or whatever. They will start giving taps and things like that. With barbel, your rod just tends to wang over. You sometimes get slightly more marginal cases where you get a bit of a shiver on the line, which kind of tells you that there's something poking around, and you just give it a bit longer and it'll normally give you a take. It seems to be almost all or nothing. You either get rod wanging bites or you don't get anything. Seems to be the situation with barbel.
It's time now, I think, for a thorough look at the tackle, separating off the barbel from the chub.
Well, I think some people will be shocked with what I use for chub fishing, because to give you some idea, when I barbel fish, I've got 2 reels, each with 2 spools, and I have 15 pound. This is like mind-blowing when we were compared when we were younger. But because of all the rocks in the river, I happily enough fishing 15 pound line for them. It's actually the line thickness that matters. It's something I never even thought about until on the Ribble or whatever, but you're looking for line that's about 0.32 or 0.33 of a millimetre through to about 0.35, and it's just to cope with the abrasion. But I also have 2 spools which have 10 pound and 12 pound on, which I might use for hook links or if it's harder conditions. For chub, you should be quite happy to fish with just a line of a few pound, but I just use 10 or 12 pound line, and I've been known to fish the 15 pound line and with a 10 pound one. They still bite or whatever. Like, I think from what I've seen, and I have to say, I'm not actually the greatest chub fisherman in the world. The people that are really good at chub fishing are actually the float fishermen, because then you can sort of wind them up on feeding the maggots and things like that. But I suppose my way, I just like the roving along, and it's such an instant thing. But what happens is you catch them quickly, but you scare them quickly as well. They're a very scary fish. The scary, Isaac Walton called them the fearfulest of fishies. And it's true. They're scared of their own shadow, a chub. So, as I say, I fish really crude, but still catch them. In terms of rods, you get these twin-tip rods, which are an Avon top and a quiver-tip top. I have a 2-pound test curve rod, and for the chub, I use it for the barbel as well, actually. I use the quiver-tip top with something like a 4-ounce or 6-ounce section. In fact, I was once lucky and I brought the tip of a quiver tip and it turned it into an 8-ounce tip, and that's absolutely perfect. But yet again, it's very crude. I use that for the chub, and I use that for the barbel when it's down, and I use the Avon top, which is 2 pound when the river's up. So that's in more flood conditions. And then I've got another rod which is a 1.5 pound test curve, and I just use the Avon top exclusively when the river's down, and it just about copes within flood. I do have a heavier rod which I very rarely use, and the quiver tip of the lighter rod, I just use that for quiver tip. I don't use that on the Ribble at all. It comes down to the fact that they're not educated, whereas you fished on the Lee, they used to drive you mental, because you would get tugs, little tap pulls, whatever, and like, if you tried steak, it was, yeah, you might, whatever, but oh crikey, you would be driven by distraction. But as I say, a lot of the river just isn't really heavily fished enough for the fish to be wary. So I'm sure anybody listening to this could actually scale down my tactics or whatever, but as I say, I find it's pretty effective. If it's good conditions, like for chub fishing, they like a bit of clarity. So the time to fish to me is like when it's fining down after flood, and started about 1.5 foot up when it's just starting to clear, and perfect's about 1 foot up, so you've still got the flow. Like, you don't want it to be really down and low and clear, because then you start getting the taps and things like that. But if you rove along these stretches, I think, and you'll probably know from fishing the summer that there's chub there, you should be looking to maybe catch 8 to 10 in the course of the day. And I've had up to like 15 or 16 on a few occasions, but whether I could catch more than that is possible, but I don't think I could catch much more than 20. That'd be about the limit for chub fishing.
I'm intrigued with this liquidised bread.
Yeah, it's one of them things you wish you'd known about. Because I came across it probably in articles in the Angling Times or whatever, and I used to get Martin James, that's a well-known Ribble fisherman, used to fish it up in the higher Ribble. I just fish it on an open-end feeder, and then a lump of flake, probably on a size 8 hook, 2 to 3 foot tail or whatever. For the day, I probably liquidise about 2 loaves up, I would say. Cheapest white bread you can get. Best if it's a little bit stale. Makes it easy liquidising it up, and it's a bit of a pain because you'll get your work surface covered in liquidised bread no matter what. Don't overfill your liquidiser. As I say, 3 or 4 casts in a peg. Cast quickly, don't hang around. Just gauge the peg. You'll know very quickly if there's anything there, and then move on. And sort of, like the more open pegs, yeah, certainly don't ignore them. You will find chub on pegs where you wouldn't expect to catch barbel, I suppose. But yeah, it's simplicity itself. That's all I would say to anybody is just try it. I don't think there's the number of chub in the river these days that it's really possible to settle down in a spot. I think that's the way to make the most of it. Occasionally I'll get a spot where you might catch 6 or 7, but normally 3 or 4 out of a spot is what you're looking for. I've only, with the years I've been fishing, there's only really 2 spots I've come across where I felt I can settle in here for a good number of hours, and they're both spots where there's a long run below you of reasonably pacey water, and you can just imagine them slowly but surely working their way up.
And down at the business end for the barbel?
I'm a feeder fisherman, and I think you definitely need to get the feeder going in. As I say, in the summer I will carry 8 to 10 pints of pellets, because if you've got 2 rods on the go and you need to fish it hard to keep the bait going in, you will get through a surprising amount. As regards to terminal tack, you don't need to be fancy. Like the one thing I would say to anybody fishing the river is be very careful with your rig. You don't want to give them any chance of them snagging up or anything like that. You've got to make sure your feed is free running, and that fish a barbel's hook as well. They won't come off, but sometimes you get a fish that snags up, and occasionally you'll come back and you'll get your feeder back and the fish is gone. And I always say, that's excellent, that worked perfectly. You don't want to have any chance of any bomb or feeders getting and the fish being tethered or anything like that. But when I do get the feeder back, that tells me that yes, it's working perfectly. But as I say, I use strong line, maybe 12 to 15 pound, but just for the thickness. It doesn't need too much. In fact, the hook link, it varies. Sometimes you use a light one. Sometimes, if it's really rocky, I've actually used even actually stronger hook link than the main line, because that's what's getting the battering. And the hook, well, I fish a tail 1.5 to 2 foot. In the winter, you might go slightly longer. But as I said, the bites you don't tend to get knocks and things. If you're getting knocks and things, I'll tell you, you've got to do something different. But what tends to happen is you get a bite or you don't. Some people use carp hooks, but I tend to use a slightly finer one. There's these S3 hooks, so kind of a medium strength hook. They're the ones I tend to use when there's a bit of water on. But when it's down, I actually use something called it's a barbless animal hook. I think it's Camison do it. It's like a size 8. And that will actually open out a bit on a rock. But it's a very simple sort of thing, just a running feeder and 2 foot tail and just a hook. And I use halibut pellet as a hook bait, fish it on a band, make some halibut pellet paste, mould it round it so you've got a little bit of extra leakage. But it probably doesn't make a vast amount of difference. As I say, other people use boilies, which I'm sure would be perfectly fine as well. But as I say, I came across this so-called time bomb method years ago. It worked on the Trent, it works on the Ribble. I've seen Mate's on the telly sort of use it, and it's been very effective. So really, why do anything different? As I said, the only time I would think differently is if it's slightly marginal conditions, and then maybe use hemp, which I think would be a better call, or that's your feed, and then use maggots or hemp, or maggots or casters on the hook.
So you use 2 rods for your barbel fishing?
I use 2 rods simply to cover the water. You get a lot of pegs where you can there's various spots which are worth trying. To say anything that catches your eye. Like sometimes there might even be 3 parts in a peg, but typically you might cast one rod in front of you and the other one 15 yard down or something like that. Like one useful piece of equipment that's very useful on the Ribble is actually a tripod. You know, like sea fishing one or more of a coarse fishing one. It's so rocky and pebbly and all the rest of it that it sort of makes life far easier. The only other thing is one occupational hazard of fishing with 2 rods, and that is that when you hook 2 fish at once, and it does occur quite a bit. Like if you do start getting this, obviously just fish with 1 rod. But yeah, it's quite fun when you've got 2 rods on the go or whatever. And I say I have a little technique. What you do is the second rod that goes, stick the rod between your leg with the reel behind your thighs and just let the fish bounce against it, and eventually it'll just kind of lie doggo. You're bent over or whatever, trying to keep your legs together, and you're playing this fish that's fighting like mad and all the rest of it. But yeah, it definitely works. About 8 or 9 times out of 10 you'll get your fish. And actually the more fun in games actually more so when you've actually netted your first fish, because you obviously have to be careful with barbel. Like when the water conditions are plenty of oxygen in the river, you know, you can put them back, but you've got to take a bit of care. Whenever you catch one, always just let it rest in the landing net for a bit. Let it get its horizontal and it's got its strength back. And if you possibly can unhook fish in the river whenever you can do that on most occasions. Don't go dragging up the bank straight away or whatever. But yeah, when you get that, and the best thing is simply to get that first fish unhooked, put it back. In the meantime, you can put your rod on the rest, and because you're kind of under a bit more control, you can just keep an eye on the other one. But as I said, the fish will tend to just bounce away because you're not pulling back, if you see what I mean. As I say, more times you'll get it, but it's interesting when it happens or whatever. Oh my God, what do I do now?
Now, a lot of the barbel stretches on the Ribble are controlled by clubs. That said, there are, as I understand it, still day ticket pegs in some of the prime areas.
There's 4 day ticket stretches on the river, but there's 2 fairly long ones and 2 fairly short ones. But the long ones there's one at the Tickle Trout, which is like by the motorway bridges, and then there's a short stretch just above it, which is a bonsai nursery. Like all these stretches are on the internet. If you search for them, you'd find them quite quickly. And there's 2 stretches at Ribchester. There's a short one in Ribchester Village Centre, which is part of one of the Radek stretches. And then there's also a long stretch above the bridge at Ribchester, which I've not fished for some time, but yet again, it's a long stretch. It's on the Ribchester side of the bridge, by the way. I believe there's also a day ticket stretch at Mitton, but I think that's only after the salmon season is finished, so that's from the 1st of November onwards. I've never actually fished it, and it'd be a long walk and all the rest of it, but sort of one that might be worth having a go for the chub in the winter time. I could imagine that being, one of these days you give it a go. And then the club stretches, there's about 4 or 5 where you can sort of join instantly, like working downriver. Warrington Anglers have a stretch at Hurst Green. Then at Elston, which is where my mate caught them barbel all them years ago, that's now shared by Wigan and District and St Helens, I don't know their full name. Then down at Preston, Southport Anglers have essentially 2 stretches. They've got the stretch at Church Deeps on the Church Deep side, and it goes up towards the bottom of Mellingswood. And they've also got a stretch below London Road Bridge, where we fished all these years ago, and that goes down to the mouth of the Darren. And then there's another Cheshire club called Bay Moulton. They have the Ribble downstream of Halfpenny Bridge on the golf course side all the way down to London Road. That's a very long stretch indeed. You can get just a Ribble only ticket for them, and I believe you can get a day ticket as well. It might even be on the bank. Then finally there's free fishing as well, there's some above London Road on the opposite side to the Bay Moulton side, and then also below London Road Bridge at Frenchwood, and also below the mouth of the Darren. And I know somebody that lived down the Continental who, I've never seen the pictures, but apparently there's photographs of him with barbel in his front room where he fished at the Continental, This well-known famous pub sort of further downriver. So there's plenty to get you started, and then sort of take it from there. That's what I would say.
To help put what you now see as your main local coarse fishing target into some sort of national perspective, give us a bit of an insight into what you've caught, what you've seen caught, and what you know has been caught from the river over recent times.
Oh, crikey. Where do you start? As I say, I've had some very big catches over the years. The best I've had in a day is 44. I've had several days where I've had 20 or 30, and not all from the same peg. I would say, once you've got to know a stretch, and as I say, you've worked your way along, you've fished the likely spots, and you've got to know it, I think you should be aiming for maybe 6 or 7 in a day in the summer in good conditions. As I say, you've got to learn your stretch, but once you've found where they are, and where they are in certain conditions, I think that's quite possible. In the winter, I would say you're aiming for probably 3 to 4 on average in good conditions. You're looking for the sort of conditions when the weathermen are saying it's mild for the time of year. When they say that, that's the time to be going. There's quite a big drop-off between good conditions in the winter and bad conditions. And certainly, I think if you catch more than 6 or 7 in the winter, you'd be doing really well, actually. It's just that they've dropped down from where they are in the summer, where they're more concentrated and they're more spread out and the conditions are colder. But it can be done. And in comparison with other rivers, you actually get a lot of articles these days about the River Wye, for example, which has become the latest sexy river for people to fish. And you've got all these big-name anglers like your Martin Bowlers of the world doing articles from the Wye. And when I read them, it's uncannily the same, if you see what I mean. They say, they catch very quickly and move along and all the rest of it. Yeah, but I think people would be gobsmacked what you can get from the river. There's just a lot of people tend to fish the same sort of pegs year round, especially the more wider open ones. They may be the ones in the winter, but during the summer, you talk to some people and they catch some after dark, and I just think, what's happened is the fish aren't there during the day, but they go foraging after dark from where they live during the day or whatever. It's a big river with a decent to good head of fish is what I would say. So if you catch it right, you can do really well. But you've just got to be prepared to work a bit and try bits where you never see other people trying. And at times you can be amazed what you find out there. There's just so much river out there.
What about future expectations, both personally and for the Ribble Barbel as a species?
Well, when it comes to going forward, as I say, things have stabilised, but I do wonder a bit about going forward. Like, obviously it's good that the roach and the dace have come back and people are getting big catches at Preston and so on. But the one thing I've noticed is that I don't think they've had any fantastic breeding years for quite a few years. It was very noticeable sort of when I first started fishing the river again. I was catching these 3/4 pound fish that were probably working backwards, probably about 3 years old. And that was probably about 2003, 2004. So it could do with a good breeding year, I have to say. And obviously they don't live forever. That generation of very big fish, I suspect that might have sort of come to an end. And then the other thing you've got to watch out for is predators on the river. Like, obviously there's various otter release programs going on, and you have heard things further upriver of people seeing otters, and people point out tracks on the bank. But you don't know. I don't know whether people say they definitely are. Like, I've seen mink for definite on the Ribble. Further down, I'm afraid you do. So it's not politically correct and all the rest of it, but there are numbers of Eastern Europeans, and I do have to say that what I would call the Preston stretches, you're not catching the number of chub that you were, and if they're fishing with spinners and plugs, they will catch them. I remember last year I was fishing a peg and got a couple of chub out of it, and then I moved up, and then somebody turned up. They weren't Eastern Europeans, and he just wound the plug through this peg and he got a chub first cast. And I've also seen on the Lee, I remember once watching somebody fish, just winding the plug off this really fast, shallow water, and he was winding it up at 100 mile an hour, and all these little chub were chasing this plug. So I do think that they will be having that sort of effect down there. It is getting quite noticeable, I have to say. So we'll have to see. As I say, I do think we need a good breeding year fairly soon, but at the end of the day, whatever's going to happen is going to happen.
And your own personal best, are they likely to be toppled?
I think it might take some doing, both in terms of numbers, because I say some of the catches we've had that has been absolutely mind-blowing. In terms of sizes, I've had a couple of 13-pounders, but they were both 6 years ago now. They were right at 2 days apart at the end of the season, funnily enough. I had one of 13-12 on the 12th of March, had two 11-pounders the following day, and then I had one of 13-5 on the final day. That was mind-blowing, really, when you think about it, something like that. Certainly it's been noticeable this last year or two. People are starting to catch 10-pounders now and the odd 11-pounder, and that fits in with what I've been catching. But as time goes on, you may need to just adjust your sights down, if you see what I mean. That's my gut feeling anyway.
No regrets then at moving back up here?
No. There were other reasons, obviously family and friend reasons as well, and to be honest, I'd had my fill of fishing down south as well. Like, as I say, you get a false impression from some of the papers, like the size of the fish, and it was all the species. They got harder and harder, but bigger and bigger. Like, for example, I've mentioned the barbel, and it started with a 5-pound, ended with a 14-pounder. But with tench, I'd never caught a 5-pound tench when I moved down south, and big gravel pit I used to fish. When I first fished it took about 2 years before I caught my first 5-pounder. Ultimately, I caught an 11.5-pounder out of it, and a 10-pounder as well. For whatever reason, fish in the south have been struggling with breeding and things like that. So yeah, I've come back, and as I say, when you came back, I was coming back for a few years once I'd stopped work, and catches were great, and then once you lived here, it was even better. Like, okay, this last year, it's been a funny year, so we'll have to see how it goes or whatever, but yeah, no regrets at all.
And final question, was it both right and a good thing to introduce barbel to a river that had evolved in terms of balance to suit a different mix of species?
Well, I might have slightly controversial views on things like this, actually, because at the end of the day, we've got an homogenised world or whatever. I remember I went to Canada last year, and I found Himalayan balsam at the bottom of some creek. So to some extent, these things are probably just going to happen no matter what. There are certain species that take over the world, they just outcompete them. It's like the old grey squirrels and the red squirrels. But in terms of the Ribble, I suppose the one thing to remember is that the Yorkshire rivers have always had barbel in them because they flowed east, as it says in the introduction. They're only native to rivers that flow east or whatever. But it's only the other side of the watershed, And the EA has been stocking barbel left, right and centre, and of course you're getting things like beavers being reintroduced into Scotland, so they are an indigenous species. So if they'd not been introduced by anglers, it is quite likely the EA would have introduced them anyway. I'm not convinced they have an effect on the salmon. I doubt they get far enough upriver to affect the breeding, though I don't quite know where they do the breeding. So yeah, it was likely to happen. Plus, interestingly, the fact they never got there, thinking about it, you always kind of get this old wives' tale about eggs being transferred on birds' legs and things like that. Well, there's been several thousand years have gone by since the end of the Ice Age, and it obviously hadn't happened, but obviously when they were in there, they found somewhere they really liked. So yeah, I think anything that's indigenous, it's kind of okay. Like whether I'd want to be introduced into Scottish game rivers is another thing entirely. I don't think you can go that far, but obviously you're probably kind of at roughly the northern limits anyway. You know, they are ultimately a Mediterranean fish. As one last thing is, don't overestimate how hot it can be and catch them. I remember down on the Lee, and you could have blisteringly hot summers and people putting brollies up to protect from the sun, and the barb will be flashing away in the peg or whatever. So they don't mind if warm anyway.
Just a case then of giving them and all the other species time to adapt and rebalance accordingly.
I think that's the case, yes. I don't think you can say there's anything on the Ribble where they've had the effect. You've seen that the roaching days have come back, big style. The chub have had to find a different balance. At the end of the day, there's only so many fish a river can support, and the barbel will be here to stay. They're not going to go. But there are benefits. Like I have a friend that's just started fishing the Ribble again, and he's been gobsmacked at the size of the chub you're catching. And actually, funnily enough, in recent years, you're not catching as many big chub or whatever. I think they just don't live as long as a species or whatever. When I started fishing the river again, catching a lot of 4 and 5 pounders, whereas now there's not quite as many, you sort of mean. But there are certainly, like, even a couple of days ago, I roved along on one of the stretches. I got 13 chub. Smallest was about a pound, biggest was about 4 pounds. So they are in there. But as I said, the days of old when people used to get £100 bags from, like, they used to catch them under the motorway bridge, and there was a spot at London Road where I think they grouped together for safety from the cormorants. I think it's unlikely to get that. I think my biggest chub catch since I've started fishing the river again is probably about 50 or 60 pounds, and I've roved along and I've had 15 or 16, and it's been a day when I've hit the bigger ones.
In summary then, a specimen river rather than a numerical or bulk weight river, though still perhaps in a state of transition with the various species vying to find sustainable levels. The barbel introduction has obviously been a factor here, but probably not the only one, as environmental legislation has its effect on water quality, with the knock-on that brings in terms of fish species mix, and what goes on out at sea also having an effect on the ability of cormorants to find sufficient food to keep them off our rivers and lakes. Ageing fish populations and spawning successes will also have their say. A case then of watch this space. So many thanks to Mike Winrow for making us aware of these factors and for the guided tour through the Ribble Barbel fishing scene.